Hello everyone, I'm back with another video. This one should be kind of exciting for some of you guys. I've noticed a lot of you have been asking me to make a tutorial, and here I am with my first official YouTube tutorial video. This is going to be a step-by-step taking you through the process of this illustration that I did of my character called Kim's. And I'll be taking you through the whole process from start. I've recorded all of it with the intent of making a tutorial, which by the way is already in written form in my new art book that's currently being manufactured. So I wanted to make a video version as well, and I wanted to be available to everybody free of charge. So without further ado, I will quickly explain all the steps that I'm going to be going through and then jump right into it. So this is the typical process that I use for most of my traditional illustrations, and the very first step is finding inspiration and references, or figuring out what it is that you're trying to draw. Step 2 is making the thumbnail. Step 3 is the final sketch. Step 4 is diluting the ink and then making an ink pass. Step 5 is shadows and tonal ink wash. Step 6 is a watercolor pass. Step 7 is finishing touches with mixed media and colored pencils. Step 8 is some sort of decorative border if necessary. It's something that I've been doing with lately. It's an optional step. And step 9 is scanning and color correcting the finished drawing in Photoshop. So I'm going to be taking you guys through all of those steps and going into a little bit of detail in each one. Before jumping into the first step, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about why I like this process so much and why I decided to share this particular process with you guys as opposed to any other one that I might use, because I do work in many different mediums and styles sometimes, and I usually do this to accommodate the nature of the project that I'm working on, and this happens to be the most concise approach that is very easy to divide into different steps. I also chose to omit any specialized equipment, specifically a light box that I do often use, but I wanted to make this tutorial more accessible, so that's something I did not use for this particular drawing. The last step in this tutorial is scanning the drawing in and editing it in Photoshop, which is an optional step technically because it's mostly to make the file printable. So if you wanted to make prints of your artwork or use it as an asset in any other way, like for your website or put it in a digital portfolio, it's a very good thing to do to flatten the drawing and make sure that it's very good quality. That's what a scanner is for. But if you're just an artist on Instagram and you just like to share your work via photos, that's totally fine as well. The reason why I want to share a clear step-by-step tutorial on how I create most of my illustrations is because I know that it can be pretty challenging to jump straight into something without really knowing what each step is. For me personally, it takes a lot of the fear out of the process and makes it a lot more approachable. I really hope that this process will be helpful to you, and I hope that you try to follow it. And of course, I'd love to hear any feedback and comments that you have, if you want me to elaborate on anything anymore, and if you wanted me to explain anything in depth, don't hesitate to let me know in the comments down below. So without further ado, I'm going to jump into step 1. The first step is figuring out what it is that you want to draw and gathering the appropriate references in order to make it easier for yourself. So I usually do this without actually drawing anything. I like to have the idea firm in my head before I pick up a pencil or a pen. So for this particular drawing, I knew what I needed to do going into it, which is make a tutorial. That was the number one reason for making this drawing, and therefore I decided to pick a subject matter that will be useful to as many people as possible. And I know that a lot of people who draw for fun love to draw characters, maybe their own characters, maybe fan art, but the most popular topic, generally speaking, seems to be a portrait of a girl. So that's what I decided to go with. And of course, in order to make it interesting for myself, I decided to draw one of my characters whom I haven't drawn in a while, so it was an extra layer of fun just for me, and that's what made it engaging. Anyways, so after I figured out what it is that I was going to draw, I went on Pinterest and looked around to see if I can find any images that can spark some sort of inspiration or idea for what I want this drawing to look like. And after scrolling for a little while, I found this one photo of a girl surrounded by some flowers. I think they're poppies. I really like the color scheme. I know that the photo is definitely edited, but I just like that the color scheme was very simple, and there was just something that jumped out at me in this photo, so I decided to use it as my main inspiration point for the drawing. I usually don't need pose references unless it's something super specific, so for a drawing like this with a relatively simple framing and subject matter, I decided to just jump straight into the thumbnail, and just the color inspiration and the flowers was enough for me to create kind of an idea of what I wanted to do, which is why I did not find any other photos. But for those of you who feel it a little intimidating going into a drawing without a reference for a pose, I suggest just maybe doing some more research, picking out some photos for some poses that might be interesting to you. Of course, this tutorial is highly modifiable, so feel free to take as many steps as you need in order to feel comfortable before you move on to the next step. So once you have all your references ready to go and you have a good idea of what it is that you want to draw, it's time to make a thumbnail. The thumbnail stage is the time to lay down all the basic elements you'd like to include in the piece and figure out how they all will fit together. When I have a clear idea of a piece in mind, 1 or 2 thumbnails are usually enough for me to move on to the next step. I do like to leave a lot up to chance when drawing for fun, so I don't usually do a lighting or color pass in the thumbnail stage, but I would definitely recommend to do that if you're a little more nervous about moving on to color or nervous about lighting and things like that. I like to leave it to chance because I have had so much experience over the years with those things. Therefore, I feel like I have enough confidence to not make mistakes that will ruin a drawing completely, even though it does happen once in a while. For me at this point, it's a rare occurrence, but I would suggest that you take all the steps necessary in order to make it as easy for you as possible and to avoid making any huge mistakes that will cause you to lose confidence in going forward with the piece. Because at the end of the day, the biggest reason why you want to be doing any of this is to have fun and to be able to look at the art when it's done and feel happy about it. But yeah, so I'll elaborate a little bit more about the thumbnail. So over the years, I have developed a sort of style for the way that I thumbnail my images. I use a very simplified style to quickly jot down the gist of the facial expression that I want the character to have. I mostly focus on the shapes when it comes to the body and the hair and the clothing, as well as like the flowers. As you can see, when I'm putting down this thumbnail, it's a little more angular than my usual stuff. I like to keep it simple, and I kind of do it to get a good sense of what I want across, but make sure that it's proportionally very similar. Sometimes when I'm doing something a little more complicated for an illustration where it's a full body, or if it's more than one character and it has a lot of elements that have to intertwine, I will make the thumbnail maybe a little bit bigger, but I never go too big, because the smaller the thumbnail is, the more I can force my brain to focus more on the shapes, because the drawing is so small, I can't really get lost in the minutia of the little details that I might want to put in later. So the most important thing for the thumbnails is just to get the shapes right and to preferably have them be in the same proportions as they will be in the final piece, because obviously it's just like a little micro version of the final piece that you're going to be aiming for. The reason why I like to keep the proportions the same is because sometimes when I work digitally, or if I want to clean up the sketch digitally, I will just take a photo of the thumbnail and draw right over it. And then it basically eliminates an extra step if I would have to just try to recreate it. It's very simple to keep the proportions the same in the thumbnail and then just draw a cleaner sketch right over it if you want to. In this particular case, of course, I didn't draw over the thumbnail because I was just drawing straight on the final piece of paper, which is not in my sketchbook, but that's something to keep in mind. And it would be a really good practice to kind of figure out a shorthand, which means like a quick way to jot down the gist of something, like a hand or a face or even the body, to just make the thumbnail process easier for yourself. Having a shorthand to draw quick shapes to communicate body parts or just elements in the drawing in general make it a lot easier to move on to a more detailed stage. And I would suggest always remembering that you want to start from the bigger shapes and then work your way towards detail, and forget about the detail at first. That's something that's always very easy to put in on top of the very basic shapes if the basic shapes are solid. The last thing I want to briefly talk about in regards to thumbnails is that a lot of ideas tend to come to me in this stage. So while I'm trying to figure out the composition and the basic shapes of things, I get a lot of ideas of what extra things I want to incorporate into the composition. So this is generally the stage where the thumbnail will maybe go into a slightly different direction than what I may have planned in my head initially. But of course, since you're working on the thumbnail, it's easy to edit things out and put in something new and remember all the ideas that come to your head. Like for instance, when I'm drawing these little thumbnails, I will often get ideas for what kind of detail I want to put in after, but I won't bother drawing it in the thumbnail stage because I know that I will just add it in the final product. So sometimes if I want to make sure I don't forget any of these little ideas, I will jot them down to the side. And I do like making notes in general. I think that's a good habit to have. You don't necessarily need to draw every single idea that comes to your mind. Sometimes I will just write a little paragraph of an idea for a drawing that I have so that I can reference that later in the future. So once you have a thumbnail that you're happy with, it's time to move on to the next step, which is step 3, the sketch. But before I start talking about the sketch, I'm just going to run you guys through the materials that I use, because the thumbnail stage and the research stage obviously is done kind of separately from the final drawing, but when you're moving into the sketch and you're using the final paper on which the drawing will be, obviously you're a lot closer to the actual process and it's no longer the preliminary stage, which is why I like to go over all the materials that I'm planning to use for the drawing and make sure they're ready to go so that I don't have to scramble looking for anything later on. So this is my list of the essential tools that I use for most of my pieces. Obviously a sketchbook for thumbnailing and a ballpoint pen, Prismacolor, color erase pencils for sketching and adding some final details later on. I usually have like several colors of those. The one I use most of the time is red or orange. A kneadable eraser to gently remove some of the graphite, lift the pencil off the paper without damaging the paper. I like to use a porcelain palette. It actually took me years to finally get one. I think I got one like a year and a half ago or so, and it's been absolutely great because before that I used like plastic palettes, and those are really difficult to clean, especially if you don't do it right away, and sometimes the ink dries really quickly. So I would totally recommend getting a porcelain palette. It's a little more expensive, but it'll last you for the rest of your life for sure. I generally like to use cold press watercolor paper. It's the one with a prominent texture as opposed to the hot press, which is more smooth. I like cold press because I do like the texture, and I think it creates really nice ink splotches, or I don't know what to call them. You know what I'm talking about. Like the inky feel is a lot more prominent with cold press paper, I think. I don't have a whole lot of experience with hot press. I've used it a couple of times. I can't really say exactly what the difference is. I would probably recommend experimenting a little bit. It is easier to do line work on hot press paper because obviously it's smoother, but I like the effect of the ink wash on hot press paper, so that's what I usually prefer. I need to keep 2 jars of clean water during the process, so I like to get those ready. One is for cleaning the brush and the other for mixing and diluting colors. I like to use a nib for inking. Sometimes I use a brush as well, but that tends to make the process too long. If you're not familiar with using nibs or brush for inking, I would suggest maybe use micron pens. Those are a lot easier to control. However, the reason why I like to use a nib, a G-nib specifically, I think it's a Deleter brand. It's like a really popular nib that manga artists use for inking the comics. I like using nibs because it gives me 100% control over what color I choose to use for the ink, so I can dilute it to any consistency that I want, and it can be any color, whereas with microns you obviously have a limited range, and usually they're just too dark. I mean, obviously it depends on what kind of effect you're going for, but for my particular process I do like to dilute my ink quite a bit, and that is why I like to use nibs for inking. My current favorite set of brushes that I've been using for maybe about half a year or so are called Betty Hayways. They're really, really pretty brushes, and they are synthetic, so they're in the brush description little thing that it comes with, it says they're synthetic sable hair brushes. They are really similar to natural brushes. I do notice they're slightly more sturdy, I guess, but I kind of I almost prefer synthetic brushes, to be honest, because they're just more sturdy. Like, the hairs keep in place, and I guess it's just, I don't know, generally a lot cheaper as well. So I'm not the best person when it comes to cleaning brushes. I think I should definitely clean them more thoroughly and a lot more often than I do, but because they're synthetic, I don't feel like I'm ruining something really expensive and precious, you know what I mean? Like, they're not nearly as expensive as natural brushes, so I feel a lot safer, you know, just using them all the time and etc. I still think that they should be cleaned more often, obviously, but I will leave a link down below in my description for these brushes. I think they're awesome and I would totally recommend them. And honestly, like, I do believe in getting things that are nice to look at, because personally I absolutely love how these brushes look, and they do add a little bit of something to the process just because they're so pretty. But anyways, and I always like to keep around some paper towels, because I do actually use paper towels quite a bit in my process to pick up any stray ink or water or whatever that I want to get rid of right away before it dries. It's kind of an essential part of my process, actually, but I'll get into a little bit more detail when it comes to that later. And lastly, I need to keep around a piece of paper on which I can test all the colors and inks and whatnot before actually using them on the final piece. This is pretty straightforward, but it's easy to forget. I would just make sure you always have one of those little papers lying around, and I usually like to make sure that it's the same type of paper that I'm drawing on, so the effect corresponds, obviously, so you're not testing on a completely different paper. And I do cut down my paper a lot. I usually buy these like watercolor pads with 15 or 20 sheets inside, and for this particular piece it was more of a square format, so I just cut a little bit off of it and I just used that as a scrap to test my paint on. So now that I've went over the basic tools that I use, I will just talk a little bit about the specific ones for this piece. I chose to use the P.H. Martin's Van Dyke Brown ink, and I diluted that with a bunch of water. Again, I will come back to that later. I usually use Winsor & Newton or P.H. Dr. Martin's ink. That's just what I happen to have bought, and the ink obviously lasts a long time, so that's just what I've been using, and they're both great brands. I would 100% recommend them to anybody. And the watercolors that I'm currently using are the Dr. P.H. Martin's Synchromatic Transparent Watercolors. And I just picked out a few colors that I know are going to be present in the piece that I'm currently working on. And obviously, it's just something that I like to do. I mean, I like to just pick the colors before I even start the drawing and just have them sitting there. And sometimes I'll go and get one that's missing. But yeah, the reason why I'm using these right now is no apparent reason. I have other watercolors that I've squeezed into a palette that I use sometimes, but these are really, really bright and vivid, so I like that a lot, but they do revive very, very easily. They're great for my process because I do all the lighting with ink, which is obviously permanent and does not revive with water, which is why my coloring, or whatever you might want to call it, is very limited. So it's just a little bit challenging to keep it within the lines to make sure you don't revive any of the other colors accidentally and have them bleed into each other. But again, I will talk about this later. I'm not exactly sure what the difference is between these Synchromatic Transparent watercolors and some other ones that this brand has, but they are quite expensive and the bottles might look small, but they do last a very long time. So I do think it's a very good investment. But yeah, those are all the tools that I'm planning to use for this drawing, and now I will talk about the sketch. So once I prepare all the materials and I have the paper that I'm going to use for the final piece ready to go, I take another look at the thumbnail and kind of plan out or try to visualize it on the paper to help me start drawing in the right place, if that makes any sense. The biggest annoyance that happens sometimes is starting a sketch that's looking pretty good, but then realizing that its placement is just off. So it's good to take a overall look at the thumbnail, maybe pick some points on the outer edges of the composition and kind of jot those down on the final sheet to help you kind of like triangulate where the best placement would be for the face, which is the center of this piece. So that's exactly what I did, and that's also why I like to use these jaggedly shaped frames and put characters into them. I think it's an interesting look to have a frame within the frame of the paper, and it also makes it very easy to place the sketch properly onto the paper. Obviously, this is a lot easier when you're sketching digitally because you can always move things around and change sizes and stuff like that. So you have to be a lot more careful when sketching right onto the paper. But once you get a good habit of doing stuff like this, it becomes much, much easier. It's just important to keep it in mind when you're starting out. So for the sketching phase, I usually tend to keep a few things in mind. And all of this is to make my life easier in the following steps. So the more precise your sketch lines are, the faster you will be able to ink it because all the guidelines will be ready to go. I don't necessarily go into too much detail in the sketch phase, but since I'm so familiar with the way I draw things, especially hair, because I don't know how to explain this exactly, but it's really, really easy to add extra details into the hair specifically. So that's something that I tend not to linger on too much. I do get very nitpicky about the shapes of the hair and the shapes everywhere in general. So this will be a thing that I focus on a lot, just like in the thumbnail, but this time it's a lot more precise. So I will start with a very light sketch so that I have the general placement of everything, and then I will go in a little bit darker just to really kind of get the proper curves down, or like the precise curves down. And a lot of this is just eyeballing it, like whatever looks best is what I tend to go with. There's some things that I sometimes try to avoid as much as I can, like when it comes to hair, you don't want to have anything too uniform, or try to avoid an obvious rhythm pattern. So what I mean by that specifically when it comes to hair is maybe like all the strands of hair are at the same distance apart from each other. That tends to happen naturally, and I still can't really shake it personally. I just do it automatically all the time. Even in this drawing, you can kind of see how the strands, like the little strands that stick out in the hair, are placed, like the distance between them is somewhat similar, and that's what makes it more uniform, and it's not as interesting. It's a lot more interesting if there's no apparent pattern that's so easily distinguishable right away. It just creates more interest when you look at the drawing, and this is kind of like a simple thing and it's easy to forget about it, but I have to remind myself all the time, and then sometimes I will just go in and erase little things like that. So avoid too much rhythm, but make sure there's a little bit. I know that's super confusing and probably doesn't help, but the thing that I said about the distance when it comes to the hair, that can apply easily to drawing leaves on a tree branch and etc. Like just placing things too close together at like an even distance, it just makes it look unnatural. Like that's the biggest pointer that I can give. But yeah, I try to keep the sketch as clean and precise as possible, like I said, to make it easier when it comes to inking in the next step. But I also omit a lot of the detail, which I can kind of just visualize while I'm drawing, and I can fill that in with the ink pen when I go to the final. So once I finish the sketch and it looks like it's pretty much good to go, I prepare for the next step, which is inking and cleaning up. So the next step is line art with diluted ink. This step is pretty straightforward. We're just tightening the line work and getting rid of the sketch underneath. So the first thing I did at this stage was mix a diluted tone of the brown ink. I like to keep the line art light so it's easy to create depth in the next step when the lines aren't too dark and harsh. And you can always add a darker pass in areas where necessary later on in the process. It's a lot more difficult to take the darkness away rather than to add it. So you have to work pretty much light to dark when it comes to ink or watercolor. That's how I like to approach it anyways. And I usually add a bit more detail in the step, and such as the rosary beads or the leaves and the flowers, and some of the hatching to indicate form in the hair and the sweater, like you can see in this drawing. I tested the ink a bunch of times before I settled on what consistency was good enough, and obviously all this takes is to just pick the color of the ink, which is brown in this case, and just keep adding water and testing it out until you feel satisfied. I like to keep it at like, I don't know, I mean, I would call this like a 40% or like a 50% range or something darkness, where if it looks pretty solid and the lines are very clear when just looking at the line work alone. But then when you go in and add in the next step, which is going to be shadows, and I will also add a dark background, you will see how it will immediately make the form look a lot more three-dimensional, because the lines are not black or really dark brown. So this process is something that I developed like a couple of years ago. It really helped me take my artwork to the next level and help add a lot of depth and dimension. Since I bounce back and forth a lot between digital and traditional mediums, I like to bring certain approaches and techniques from one to the other. Obviously, since I learned how to draw on paper and using traditional media first, I brought a lot of that into Photoshop, and it was a little bit hard to get used to Photoshop at first, but then once I got proficient in that, I started using some of my Photoshop techniques in traditional media, which is why this is such a straightforward approach, because I do think about it kind of like layers, and having the line art be kind of diluted and not too dark is almost like having the line art layer in Photoshop set to like some sort of blending mode, or lowering down the opacity so that it blends into the final the colors or the shadows, if that makes more sense to those of you who like to draw digitally. So taking it slow and being precise in this step really pays off. This is the most decisive step, which will dictate how the rest of your drawing will go, because after this everything is relatively straightforward since you've set everything down in pretty much in stone. And I really like to take my time on the face to make sure that that area is free of mistakes. And then even if you make some little errors anywhere else in the drawing, they should be pretty easy to cover up, since that's not going to be your focal point. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. But yeah, if you're using a nib, I would just suggest you be careful, because even now, like after using it for so many years, I still get impatient sometimes and I drop ink. Thankfully, it doesn't dry too quickly, and having that paper towel nearby is very handy, because if you can swiftly take the paper towel and mop up the ink, it won't leave too much of a mark. I'm pretty sure I dropped ink at some point on this drawing, but thankfully you can't really see it in the end because I did mop it up very quickly. But yeah, so I will conclude this part at this step, because I can see how I can really have a lot of things to talk about at each step, and I do think that they could be useful to you guys. So I'm just gonna cut this tutorial in half, and this will conclude the first half of the tutorial. So I will see you soon in part 2, in which I will tell you about the next and final steps of the drawing. So thank you for watching my video. I really hope you found it helpful, and please comment below and let me know if you'd like me to talk about anything else, or if there's something you didn't quite understand. I'll see you in part 2. Bye!